All right, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on a warm Thursday afternoon at Columbia College, and we appreciate you being here. This is the next in our series of Beyond Gold. Beyond Gold Stories Across Culture is brought to you by the Tuolumne Band of Miwok Indians, the Condamore Building Bridges, the Tuolumne County Historical Society, Columbia State Historic Park, nice to see you as well, and of course Columbia College. Thank you all for being here. Today's, I say session, lecture, I don't know, happening, I think is what this is entitled From Guangdong to Gold Mountain, a story of Chinese immigration, exclusion, and community. And my job is to introduce Lindsay Laney, who will introduce Professor Shannon Van Zandt in just a second. Martin Buber, a European philosopher, said, to be old, to be getting old, can be glorious if you've not unlearned how to begin. And so I think as we all age, I think we're all planning on getting older. And Stephanie's here, thank you, great conversation last time, thank you. And as we get older, what's the best way to do that? How do you keep learning how to be young in your mind? And what neuroscience has found is that one of the ways to do that is to continually be open to complex, wondrous, new experiences, to be open to the fullness of the human event. In fact, your brain is built that way. Your brain is built over many, I would say 13.5 billion years, right? To get to the point in which it is built on your need for a broad diversity of experiences and meeting new people every day. This is why COVID didn't go so well, right? So I guess what I'm saying is be curious about others. And how do you do that? How do you climb that mountain of gold of learning? Well, you know, I've got a quote from the Confucian Analects to get us started today. And it is this, and then I'll hand things off to Lindsay Laney. And Confucius said this: the man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chad. So my name is Lindsay Laney. I'm the faculty coordinator of the Academic Achievement Center here at Columbia College, which is our peer tutoring center. And being faculty here, we wear lots of different hats and have lots of different roles. And so I'm also one of our chairs of our Cultural Enrichment Committee, where we do different events and activities to uplift our minority students, and really things also for our greater community. So we're really excited to have you all here. This is a speaker series that, like Chad mentioned, has been a partnership with the Historical Society, Condamore Building Bridges, Columbia State Parks, Tuolumne Band of Miwoks, and really excited just about this, the interwoven histories of these communities whose presence and contribution shaped our area long before and long after the gold rush. So I'd like to begin our program actually with the Columbia College Land Acknowledgement. For millennia, indigenous peoples of the southern central Sierra Miwok have honored, protected, and stewarded this land we cherish. Columbia College acknowledges the land on which we stand is the unceded traditional home of the Central Sierra Miwok peoples, including local sovereign tribal nations such as the Tuolumne Band of Miwok Indians, the Chicken Rancheria Miwok Indians of California, the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation, the Jackson Rancheria Band of Miwok Indians, the Ione Band of Miwok Indians, the California Valley Miwok Tribe, and other California Indian and indigenous peoples who now live here. We recognize the years of ill-conceived policies and the breaking of sacred covenants in regard to Native peoples. In order to bring healing to the land, we acknowledge the wrongs in our history against Native peoples and commit to honoring them and building positive relationships to move toward a brighter future where all peoples of this land live reconciled as interdependent stewards. And now I'd like to introduce Linda Crocker, who is from the Tuolumne County Historical Society.
I just want to say welcome also, and a big thank you for including us in this speaker series. We think it's very important that we do these sorts of events and we continue to learn about our history. And we have a table set up in the little opening there if you care to join. And we would love it if you would take a look and join us. We are filled with volunteers who devote themselves to our museum in Sonora and our research center. And it's exciting and it's wonderful. So anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy you're here too. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Christina Muro, and I'm a faculty member here at Columbia College and also a tri-chair on the Cultural Enrichment Committee. Our featured speaker this afternoon is our Columbia College history and political science instructor and former Calaveras County archivist, having had more than 20 years of experience working in education and public history. Please help me welcome Professor Shannon Van Zandt.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I want to start by saying that this lecture is from a historical perspective. So this is the way that Western history tells this story. Many of our Chinese migrants who came to the United States in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s came from this region in southern China, Guangdong province. The capital of Guangdong is Guangzhou. Anybody ever heard of this? You might know it better as Canton. In Western history, we use the word Canton to describe Guangzhou. This is where we get our words like Cantonese, so the Cantonese language and Cantonese food. And this is a Western term because when the Portuguese started trading with Guangzhou, they misheard the pronunciation of the word. And so they didn't hear Guangzhou, they heard Kantao. And then the British heard Kantao as Canton. So this region and this city has over 2,000 years of history, and for most of that history, it was a gateway to the Western world. This is where the West enters China. And part of that is because Guangzhou sits at the terminus of the maritime Silk Road. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the more famous counterpart, the Silk Road. The maritime Silk Road served the same purpose as the Silk Road, transporting goods and people and ideas, except the maritime Silk Road used sea routes. And goods could leave Guangzhou and travel sea routes past India and the Middle East and eventually to Europe. The importance of Guangzhou changed drastically in 1757. And in 1757, the emperor of the Qing dynasty created a proclamation that made Guangzhou the only port in China that was legally open to foreign trade. So all other ports in China were closed to foreigners, and that made Guangzhou the funnel for all trade from the West and anywhere else in Europe, and all had to come through Guangzhou. And this system, in history, we call the Canton system. Not the Guangzhou system, but because this is our Western perspective, using the term that we call the city to describe this very limited entry point into China. But because all of the trade and access was funneled into this one location, the residents of Guangdong district and province and the city really had a long history of exposure to multiple cultures and languages and ideas and goods. It was a really diverse, sort of multicultural location. And it is from this region, especially the rural areas surrounding Guangzhou, that most of the migrants came to the United States from. But when we talk about immigration in the United States, there has to be more than just people wanting to come here, right? There have to be things that are pushing them out of where they are. And so in southern China, in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, there was a series of natural disasters, floods and droughts, which led to famines, which created this economic hardship for most families. And the eldest sons of Chinese families really bore the weight of the financial responsibility and the economic well-being of the family and community. And in the midst of these natural disasters, there were also some foreign entanglements, and those are the Opium Wars. There are two Opium Wars. The first one was from 1839 to 1842, and the second one was from 1856 to 1860. Anybody heard of the Opium Wars? Yeah, these were the wars that were being fought because the Qing dynasty tried to stop the illegal trade of opium by foreign merchants, specifically the British Empire. And the British Empire was like, no, you're not going to tell us what we can and can't trade. And so there were a series of wars fought over the control of this. In the end, the British Empire was successful in these conflicts, and in their success, it effectively ended the Canton system and opened trade in China because the Chinese people lost control over their own trade, and now it was in the hands of the British. History has shown us that when there are tumultuous times, there are often attempts at what we call today regime changes, or sometimes we can call them dynasty changes if we're talking about Chinese history. And so in the midst of all of this is the Taiping Rebellion. And the Taiping Rebellion was an internal conflict between the Qing dynasty and the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And this was fought a lot due to these previous factors, sort of the foreign influence, the natural disasters, and this, it is estimated that the Taiping Rebellion, about 20 to 30 million people lost their lives in China during this rebellion, which was about 5 to 10% of the population. And during the Taiping Rebellion, there were a series of other uprisings, like the Red Turban Rebellion, which tried to reinstate the Ming Dynasty, which was the dynasty previous to the Qing Dynasty. So they tried to reinstate the previous Ming Dynasty. They weren't successful in doing that, but essentially was the Taiping Rebellion was able to further destabilize China and add to the economic hardships, and this kind of pushed Chinese out of this region. And they don't immediately come to the United States. Between 1821 and 1845, roughly 3 million laborers left China to work overseas in places like Singapore and Peru and the Caribbean plantations and Southeast Asia. And most of these migrants were the eldest sons of their families who had had that enormous pressure to provide the economic well-being for their families. And their job was to go abroad, to earn some money, and then to bring that wealth back to China. And so it's in this context, so familiarity with the Western world through the Canton system and funneling the trade, a history of migration to seek opportunity, a civil war that decimated a large portion of the population, that Chinese were looking to improve their situation. And it just so happens, in 1848, gold was discovered in California. And this discovery of gold, the news traveled very quickly across the Pacific Ocean. And when it reached China, along with many other people, the Chinese came to California for economic opportunity. In 1849, there were only 54 Chinese people recorded in California. But as news of the gold spread, more people from lots of locations, including Guangdong province, came to California. And throughout the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, about 4,000 Chinese immigrants came per year to the United States. By the time Chinese immigration was halted in 1882, over 300,000 Chinese migrants had entered the United States, the majority of them settling in California. The journey here was not easy. And so I'm going to tell you the story of one migrant named Fang Zhengsheng. And his journey will illustrate what the journey looked like for many Chinese immigrants. So Fang Zhengsheng was a husband and a father of 5. He had 4 sons and a daughter. And like many men, when he heard news of the gold rush, he really wanted to try to make his fortune in California. So he decided to try his luck. He left home with 2 of his sons, his oldest son and his 4th son, and they left their village hoping that they would find work in California and return with wealth. And their journey began in their village of Dintao, and they walked half a day to the next largest city of Foshan. And it's here that they boarded a small boat, and they paddled through the waterways of the Pearl River Delta to the port city of Guangzhou, or Canton. From here, they got on another larger boat, where they went to Hong Kong. And it's in Hong Kong where they could board a trans-Pacific vessel to then come to San Francisco. The voyage across the Pacific was pretty harsh. Passengers were packed into 3-tiered wooden bunks. The bunks were only about 6 feet long and about 13.5 inches wide, and they had about 17 inches of headroom. The hatches to below deck were often sealed. This was both to keep people below deck, and it was also sealed to keep water out, especially in really rough seas. So, as you can imagine, the air below deck really smelled pretty bad. It smelled of human waste, sickness, and even death. Food and water were scarce, and disease spread really rampantly during the over 2-month journey. And yet, thousands of these migrants endured these conditions because the promise of Gold Mountain seemed worth the risk. When Fang Dongsheng and his sons arrived in San Francisco in 1867, immigration was largely unregulated. There were no there was no immigration system, no customs inspections, and no federal immigration officers. So when Fong arrives on the docks of San Francisco, he had thought that somebody would be meeting him there, but there was nobody there to meet him. So he exits the ship with his sons, and he doesn't really know what to do or where to go. But eventually, he heard somebody speaking his dialect of Cantonese and followed the sound of the voice. That voice was a man who was a labor agent. The labor agent gathered Fong and his sons and several other migrants into a single file line and led them away from the docks and into the heart of San Francisco and into San Francisco's Chinatown. They stayed in Chinatown only briefly. With the help of the Chinese 6 companies, they were able to obtain supplies and information about routes to the gold mines. And within a few days, Fong and his sons boarded another vessel traveling up the Sacramento River Delta to the California gold mines. So, who were these Chinese 6 companies? The Chinese 6 companies, sometimes called the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Associations, they were formed in San Francisco in the 1850s by leaders from different regional districts from Guangdong province, usually organized by language. And because most Chinese immigrants came from specific counties or linguistic groups in Guangdong province, these Chinese 6 companies were organized around that identity. The main 6 companies are listed here. They started as 4 in the 1850s. One of them split off into 2, so that there are 6 Chinese 6 companies. The Ningyang, the Hapluo, the Kongqiao, the Yongluo, the Samyup, and the Tianluo. Notice that 5 of these are Cantonese companies and 1 is Hong Kong. This will play later. The role of the Chinese 6 companies were to essentially perform the functions that government institutions do for us today, but that Chinese migrants didn't have access to. And so for newly arrived migrants, the Chinese 6 companies would often help them find employment, provide temporary housing, arrange travel to mining camps and later railroad work sites. They would also supply basic food and equipment, and overall they helped these immigrants navigate American society. So you have to imagine that many of these migrants, when they came to San Francisco, came with almost nothing. They had very little money, and they really relied on the 6 companies, especially during their first days in California, just as Fong Dongsheng did. And these 6 companies would also try to maintain order within the Chinese community. And they worked to resolve disputes. They often tried to prevent violence from competing groups. And essentially, the Chinese 6 companies functioned as a form of community self-government for these Chinese immigrants. But they were not completely unified. The leadership of the 6 companies often attempted to prevent or resolve conflicts, but they were not always successful. And so in Jackson, California, over in Amador County, though at this time it would have been Calaveras County, that's information for another lecture. But in Jackson, Chinese migrants from across the gold mining region, they gathered to settle a dispute between the rival Cantonese 6 companies and the Hong Kong company. The only information that we really know about these conflicts come from the newspapers at the time. And so all of this information is through the white miner's lens. And these are examples from the San Joaquin Republican, published at the time, and observers here estimate that as many as 2,000 Chinese men were present. And fortunately, they did not come to blows in Jackson, and they dispersed peacefully. But in Weaverville, in August of the same year, things did not end as peacefully. In this case, the Young Wu Company and the Si Yup and then the Young and the San Yup Company, they fought over a disagreement about a gaming house that had occurred months earlier. So Weaverville, in California, was once home to 2,000 Chinese gold miners, and it is currently the oldest Chinese temple that is still standing in California. So there's still evidence of this, of the Chinese population here. This is a really interesting article because it's actually signed by Ha-Sing, G.T., and Ah Ching. And they wrote into the Shasta Courier to kind of dispel the rumors that had been going around about this altercation. And so we get it from their perspective. And so it's really interesting that there were these other rumors about tax collecting and about mining issues. And so they write in and they're like, no, there was some cheating at a gaming house. We've been trying to resolve it, and we couldn't. And then I think the one most of us are most familiar with is the one here in Chinese camp in Tuolumne County. There's a really nice placard out there that claims that this is the site of the first Tong War in California. And I hope that you can see that it wasn't the first. There were previous ones, and I would even challenge the idea that it was a Tong War. The Tongs are a different entity of the Chinese Six Companies. But either way, there was a confrontation in Chinese camp. That is absolutely true. And in October of 1856, the members of the Young Wu and San Yup groups, they fought over a mining claim on the Stanislaus River. One story is that one of them rolled a boulder into the other's claim. The other story is that one group was working in the claim of the other group. We don't really know which one is actually happened, but we do know it was over a mining claim. And we know that they gathered, as the article says, and in this case, 4 Chinese were killed, and the estimated numbers of Chinese at this conflict was anywhere between 850 to 4,000, depending on which newspaper article you read and whose perspective you take. And despite these internal conflicts that the Chinese Six Companies face, they still remained one of the most important stabilizing institutions for Chinese immigrant society. When Chinese immigrants came to California, they came, like many other people, to mine gold. However, Chinese miners often approached mining very differently from many American and European miners. Where many miners rushed quickly from one claim to another, hence gold rush, Chinese miners often adopted a more patient and systematic approach to mining. They worked in organized teams rather than individually, And these teams were able to pool their money to purchase equipment and supplies. And they divided then the profits from this work also. And this cooperative system really allowed them to operate more efficiently and to share the risk involved in mining. Instead of abandoning a mining claim, once the easily accessible gold had been removed, they frequently worked older claims that had been abandoned. They also reworked tailings, and that is what you see here. These are the piles of gravel and sediment that were left behind from earlier miners. And by carefully processing these tailings, Chinese crews were often able to recover smaller amounts of gold that others had missed. One common technique was for them to use rockers and long tongs. And these were wooden devices that were used to wash sediment and separate gold from gravel. Chinese miners were also known for constructing sluice boxes, and a sluice box would allow running water to wash the large quantities of sediment down and allowing the smaller particles of gold to get caught in the riffles along the bottom of the box. Chinese miners were known for their extreme efficiency, and observers frequently commented that the Chinese crews wasted very little material, and they used every possible technique to recover gold from a claim. That sounds amazing. Except, this careful and methodical style really frustrated other miners who had thought that they had already gotten all of the gold from these claims and tailings, and were really frustrated with the success that the Chinese were able to have using this efficient and methodical approach. And so anti-Chinese sentiment grew very early and very rapidly in California. And in fact, it began almost immediately. In California Governor Bigler in 1852 gave a speech to the California State Legislature on what is often referred to as the Chinese question. And he raised an alarm over the, quote, present wholesale importation into this country of immigrants from the Asiatic quarter of the globe, in particular that class of Asiatics known as coolies. Now, coolie is a derogatory term used to describe Chinese labor. He declared that all of these coolies were hired by Chinese masters to mine for gold, while their families in China were being held hostage. He called upon the state legislature to impose heavy taxes on the Chinese, and he called for a law barring Chinese contract labor from California mines. Only a couple of years later, in the first history of San Francisco, in 1855, there's an entire portion of this history dedicated to this quote-unquote coolie labor. This is hard to see from here, but I'm going to read you a small portion of it. The manners and habits of the Chinese are very repugnant to Americans in California. Of different language, blood, religion, and character, inferior in most mental and bodily qualities, the Chinaman is looked upon by some as only a little superior to the Negro, and by others as somewhat inferior. It is needless to reason upon such a matter. Those who have mingled familiarly with celestials have commonly felt before long an uncontrollable sort of loathing against them. John's person does not smell very sweetly. His color and the features of his face are unusual. His lying, knavery, and natural cowardice are proverbial. He dwells apart from white persons, hurting only with countrymen, unable to communicate his ideas to such as are not of his nation. In short, there is a strong feeling, prejudice it may be, awaiting in California against all Chinamen, and they are nicknamed, stifled about, and treated very unceremoniously by every other class. And so it is in the midst of this sentiment that one of the earliest forms of legal discrimination in the form of the foreign miners tax was passed in California. It was first passed in 1850, and it required foreign miners to pay $20 a month for the right to mine. This tax applied mostly to Mexican and Chinese miners, though it did affect others as well. Enforcement was inconsistent at best and violent at worst. This law was eventually repealed, but in 1852 it was reinstated, this time at $4 per month, and it specifically targeted Chinese miners. The foreign miners tax effectively institutionalized discrimination in the mining economy. But legal discrimination is only part of the problem. Chinese miners faced harassment and violence in the mining districts. White miners sometimes claim-jumped Chinese miners, often violently, forcing them to abandon their profitable ground, and in some cases, claim jumpers destroyed entire Chinese camps, confiscated their equipment, and sometimes led to death. Local mining districts often passed informal rules to keep Chinese out of the mining district. For example, here in Columbia in 1852, the miners of the town of Columbia held a mass meeting to protest the presence of Chinese miners and attempted to exclude them from the Columbia Mining District. Similar meetings were held in nearby communities, including Jamestown, where white miners organized to oppose Chinese miners. These meetings show that there is this growing belief amongst white miners that Chinese workers do not belong in the California gold fields. In addition to the anti-Chinese sentiment, Chinese miners faced another major disadvantage, and that is they had very little protection under American law. In 1853, a Chinese miner named Ling Sing was murdered while white miners were claim-jumping his claim. 3 white men were arrested for the crime. They were brothers George Hall and John Hall and Samuel Wiseman. George Hall was accused of shooting the victim in the back with a shotgun as he ran away. He was tried for murder, while the other 2 were only tried as accessories to murder. The jury trial for the Hall brothers saw the prosecution call 12 witnesses. 3 of them were Chinese. The defense called 16 witnesses. At the time of the trial, there was no objection to the Chinese witnesses, but the defense did try to get part of the Chinese testimony excluded in this trial. In the end, the jury found George Hall guilty of murder, found John Hall not guilty, and Samuel Wiseman not guilty. George Hall was sentenced to death by hanging. He appealed his sentence, and in October 1854, it came before the California Supreme Court. And the basis of the appeal cited a section of the California Act concerning civil cases that said that Blacks and Native Americans or mixed-race individuals could not testify against white people. And so in this appeal, the the lawyers argued that this should then also be extended to Chinese witnesses. And California Supreme Court Justice Murray wrote the majority opinion, which overturned Hall's conviction. And in his ruling, he stated that Chinese were, quote, a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior, and that they had no right to negatively impact the fate of an American citizen, and they could not participate in administering the affairs of our government. This ruling had enormous consequences. Essentially, if a Chinaman was robbed, assaulted, or driven off his claim, he had no legal way to seek justice because Chinese testimony could not be used in court. The only way he could seek justice was if he could find a white person who could testify against the crime. This now meant that crimes against Chinese minors increased rapidly, and they frequently went unpunished. The 1860s saw a series of anti-coolie laws. In California, in 1862, this was passed by the legislature in California, and it is called an Act to Protect Free White Labor Against Competition with Chinese Coolie Labor, and to discourage the immigration of the Chinese into the state of California. This law imposed a monthly tax on Chinese laborers, not just minors now, any Chinese laborer, working in the state to discourage Chinese labor from competing with white workers and to reduce the number of immigrants coming to California. Not all Chinese migrants found success in mining. Many instead became wage laborers. In 1861, California passed the Swamp and Overflow Act to encourage levee building in the Delta. Between 3,000 and 4,000 Chinese laborers came to the Delta under contract to American developers and built hundreds of miles of levees. They cut drainage ditches, they built floodgates, and they slowly piled up small levees. Thanks to their labor, between 1860 and 1880, a total of 88,000 acres was reclaimed from the Delta marshlands. But the one I think most of us know when it comes to Chinese labor is their labor in building the Transcontinental Railroad. So in the 1860s, California faced a severe labor shortage. Many white miners had actually left California for the Nevada silver mines. And as the railroad executives were working to get building on the Transcontinental Railroad, they were having a hard time finding workers. These railroad managers initially doubted the ability of the Chinese to do the work. They thought Chinese workers were smaller, that they were weaker, that they were unable to handle this difficult task. But the Central Pacific Railroad at first hired 50 Chinese workers, and they sort of overturned those negative assumptions that the managers had. Chinese workers demonstrated remarkable skill and discipline. Soon these railroad companies were actively recruiting Chinese labor, and they actually sent contractors directly to Guangdong province to recruit more Chinese workers. Chinese workers were hired as masons, carpenters, cooks, translators, medical professionals, but even despite all of this, racial inequalities remained. Chinese workers were paid an average of 30% less than their white counterparts. They were also in segregated work camps and had to pay for their own lodging, food, supplies, and equipment. This disparity came to a head in 1867 when the Chinese workers who were working along a 30-mile section of track from Cisco to Truckee in California, they stopped work. And they demanded a pay raise from $30 a month to $45. They also requested shorter work hours, so instead of working from dawn to dusk, they wanted 10-hour work days. They also asked for shorter shifts in the tunnels that they were digging and blasting through in the Sierra Nevada. And as a result of this, Charles Crocker, he stopped supplying food to the labor camp and essentially tried to starve them out. And he said essentially that I'm not negotiating with you. And I'm not increasing your wages, we're not decreasing your hours, but if you want to eat, you should get back to work. And if you want a paycheck, you should probably get back to work. And so after a week of no food, the Chinese strike ended. Most of the men agreed to return to work, and work on the mountain resumed. And this was very dangerous work. Chinese laborers were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, especially blasting tunnels like this through the granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And one of the most remarkable examples of their work can be seen at Donner Pass, and this is the China Wall. And this is a stone structure made without any mortar. So the stones were fitted together like a puzzle, sort of creating this wall that has stood the test of time. They also spent years blasting through the granite, making these tunnels. This is Summit Tunnel here in Donner Pass. They worked through all weather conditions, and it's estimated that over 1,000 Chinese laborers died between 1865 and 1869 while building the Transcontinental Railroad. When the construction project ended, these Chinese workers suddenly found themselves unemployed, and they moved to other industries like agriculture and fishing and domestic service and urban businesses such as laundries and restaurants. And during the economic downturn of the 1870s, many white workers began blaming Chinese laborers for declining wages and job competition. Politicians and labor leaders used this resentment to build anti-Chinese political movements led by Californians. Newspapers and political speeches increasingly portrayed Chinese immigrants as unassimilable outsiders, taking jobs from white workers. During this time, another discriminatory law was passed in San Francisco, known as the Q Ordinance, and it required prisoners in the city jail to cut their queue, which is the traditional braided hairstyle. And because cutting this queue was culturally humiliating and could cause punishment, the law specifically targeted Chinese prisoners. It was eventually struck down by the courts. And cutting the queue was also something that white miners tended to do when they assaulted Chinese miners in the mines as well. In 1882, the United States Congress, mostly at the behest of California, passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is the first federal law in American history to ban immigration on nationality or ethnicity. Anybody want to guess how long it was in effect to?
10 years. 10 years.
1943.
60 years in total because it was renewed and renewed.
Renewed and renewed, yep. This law banned the immigration of Chinese laborers, prevented Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. They couldn't even apply for citizenship. And it required Chinese residents to carry documentation. But because this law allowed entry for the children of Chinese immigrants, many migrants began using a system that becomes known as the paper sons and paper daughters. In this system, Chinese immigrants who were already living in the United States would claim that a child was their son or daughter on official documentation, even if no biological relationship existed. This allowed that child to immigrate to California under the Chinese Exclusion Act. So you could bring your family members over if you were already here. And so the paper sons and paper daughters create families on paper even if there is no biological relationship. What had begun decades earlier as a hopeful migration to Gold Mountain had now become a story of legal exclusion. Chinese immigrants who had helped build the railroads, mine the gold fields, reclaim the Delta, suddenly found themselves officially barred from entering the country that it helped build. Despite discrimination and later exclusion, Chinese immigrants created really strong and vibrant communities known as Chinatowns. The earliest and largest developed in San Francisco, which served as the primary port of entry for Chinese immigrants coming to California. These were far more than just residential areas. They really were the economic, cultural, and social heart of the Chinese community. Within these communities, migrants could find Chinese-owned stores selling familiar food and goods, restaurants and tea houses, herbal medicine shops, traditional doctors, temples for religious worship, gambling houses and social halls, boarding houses for newly arrived immigrants. These institutions helped immigrants maintain cultural traditions while living thousands of miles away from home. For many migrants, Chinatown was the one place they could speak their own language, practice their customs, and live within a supportive community network. While San Francisco's Chinatown became the largest Chinese community in the United States, smaller Chinatowns appeared throughout the mining regions, including in towns of Sonora, Columbia, and Angels Camp. They established neighborhoods with stores and temples and communal gathering places. Another settlement developed in Chinese Camp, here in Tuolumne County, a town whose very name reflects the presence of Chinese miners during the gold rush, but this lithograph does not. So we know they were there, not only because of the name, but in 1866, a meeting of Chinamen residing in Chinese Camp was held, and at this meeting they organized to form an association to purchase property, a little piece of land for the purpose of a cemetery. The name of this association was the Jichong Company, and they elected 6 trustees, including Ah Sao chairman and Chow Hu secretary. The story here of Happy Hen Chow is going to illustrate the personal side of this history. Hen Chow was born on July 4th, 1865 in China. At age 19, he traveled across the Pacific to San Francisco, where he eventually settled in Angels Camp. He was very well known in the local community, And he was even chosen as the bat boy and mascot for the Angels Camp baseball team here in the center. His first job was working a hand laundry along Angels Creek, but after a winter flood washed that away, he went to work at a local restaurant and became a cook's helper and later purchased a restaurant. The restaurant was destroyed by fire in 1900, and he eventually moved to Sonora, where he worked as a dishwasher for Hop Key. He was also widely loved in the Sonora community. In 1942, when the film For Whom the Bell Tolls was being filmed in the area, the location manager for Paramount Pictures, Sid Street, adopted him as the mascot for Paramount Pictures. He would buy him suits and cigars and send him $200 every year. When Hen Chow died in 1948, friends across the community attended his funeral, and Paramount Pictures even sent a large blanket of red roses that covered much of his casket. His story reminds us that Chinese immigrants were not only laborers and migrants, they were also neighbors, friends, and members of local communities. And sometimes they were mascots. Locke, California, is the largest and most intact rural Chinese American town in the United States. It was built in 1915 by Chinese immigrants from Guangdong province. Locke was established after a fire destroyed the Chinese section of Walnut Grove, and while some residents rebuilt in Walnut Grove, a group of 6 businessmen, Chinese businessmen, decided to establish a new town about a mile north of Walnut Grove. The land was leased from George Locke, owner of land known as Lockport along the Sacramento River levee. Why was it leased? Well, Chinese could not legally own land in California due to the California Alien Land Law, 1913. So if you remember, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants cannot become naturalized citizens, and so their status is always that of alien. And so in 1913, with the California Alien Land Law, California said that no aliens could own land in California. And so the Chinese had to lease the land from Locke, and Locke agreed to allow the residents to own the buildings, but not the land, which remained in the hands of the Locke family. Locke became the only Chinese town in the United States built by Chinese immigrants for Chinese immigrants during this era of exclusion. So the story of Chinese immigration to the United States is a story of migration, hardship, opportunity, and resilience. From the villages of Guangdong to the mining camps of California, from the tunnels of the Sierra Nevada to the streets of Chinatown, Chinese immigration helped shape the economic and cultural development of the American West. Yet they did so while facing discrimination, exclusion, and legal barriers. That's it. Any questions? Yes, she said I would get back to why there were 5 Cantonese companies and 1 Hong Kong company in the 6 companies. So the Young Wo company is the Hong Kong company, and when we went through the Tong Wars or company conflicts, it was always the Young Wo company, the Hong Kong company, versus the Cantonese companies. Good question. Other questions?
When did the women come? Let's put it that way. When did the wives come?
When did the, oh, my microphone is blinking. When did the women come? I left women out of here for a couple of reasons. The women, according to white records, were all prostitutes.
Yeah.
And so you can look at the US federal census in 1860, and you can see a Chinese man and a woman and some children, and that woman would be listed as a prostitute. And so there were Chinese prostitutes here. They did come as prostitutes, they also came as wives, and it's a really difficult to distinguish what was actually happening versus what the records show. So, does that kind of answer it? Okay. Other questions?
I'm going to embellish a little bit on the story of the Chinese and the Opium Wars. When I was growing up, I was sort of ashamed of the Chinese because of opium. And then I find out later, for crying out loud, it was the British. The British! Because all the goods, now what was popular during that period of time were Asian silks, Asian goods, lacquerware, spices. And so the King of England said, hey, man, there ain't no balanced trade here. And he says, I'm going to do something about this. So he goes down to the colonies, the British colonies in India, where they grew poppies. And what do you get from poppies but opium? And he was sneaking opium across the border. The Emperor of China says, hey, dude, you stop this. I don't like this. You're addicting my people. And as she mentioned, the King of England says, who on earth do you think you are? I am the Earl of Leicester. I am the Duke of York. And you are the Emperor of this third world rinky-dink country. You don't tell me what to do. And so that's how the Opium Wars started. Now, picture this in your mind. Yes, the Chinese invented gunpowder. But during the Opium Wars, you got these big old British ships coming in, cannons and rifles. And the Chinese, on the other hand, had pitchforks, swords, and who's going to win, right? So they lose the war, and the Emperor says, hey, and that's, by the way, that's how Hong Kong became a British port, Macau, same thing. And so the Emperor says, I can't pay for this war. So he taxed the peasants very, very heavily. And when we talk about Guangdong, the Canton area, they're largely farmers. My people are from there. They were farmers. And because they couldn't pay the taxes, they lost everything. They lost their land, they lost their equipment, they lost just everything. And that's where the dream, like all of us with our immigrant backgrounds, the Irish, the Italians, the French, whatever you are, had this dream of coming to California. They didn't give a rip about agriculture. They didn't give a rip about the environment. What they wanted was to extract the gold, go home, and live in luxury. And the Chinese were the same way. And lo and behold, what they discovered here was really unbelievable. One other thing that wasn't mentioned was that aboard ship, because they lived in such close quarters and coming across the ocean, they contracted tuberculosis. And a lot of them died, and they just threw bodies overboard. So, it's a sad story. It's a sad, sad story, but I think all of us, look at your roots, man. We all have sad stories. We're all from immigrants, unless we're Native Americans. So, with that having been said, by the way, the Mercedes, as I told you before, she made mention of the Chinese going to Peru. My ancestors did that during that period of time. Anyway. Okay, that's enough.
Thank you, Doug. Wonderful presentation, Shannon. Thank you so much. And You ended with a beautiful phrase, we are a village. And my question is, in our village, which stories we learn? What is the history we learn? And how these stories we learn influence how we relate to each other. So the purpose of our speaker series is to widen our village, to learn together and to see each other with the humanity that each of us deserve. Thank you so much for being here today, and we want to remind you that next month we continue with the speaker series with Latinos in the Mother Love. Thank you very much.